everyone to a session on health informatics. As Emma just said, we're going to be recording this session, so just keep that in mind, but I welcome any questions that you might have. Let me just share my screen here and we'll launch into some background on health informatics. So certainly been a time when people are very much aware of health and how we navigate the world given different health settings. So what I wanted to sort of talk about today was to really sort of focus on my research so that you can see sort of what's coming down the line, 5 or 6 years from now, but also wanted to reflect a little bit on other activities that you might be engaged in as you sort of pursue a career in health informatics. There's a huge demand for folks in health informatics. People are constantly trying to recruit into this area. So regardless of whether you sort of have a health background and you want to sort of pick up the informatics part, or if you have an informatics part and want to pick up the health part, or maybe you have neither and want to learn both, there's definitely a demand for these kinds of skills. So let's sort of kick off with a couple of examples of where you might work if you're interested in health informatics. One place that you might work is at a local public health office. So you probably do lots of tasks there, like sharing health information with consumers, but you might also collaborate with local physician groups in order to establish clinical guidelines that folks might use when they're actually seeing patients. And so the question here is, how would you know when those guidelines should be updated? Well, maybe you're not in a public health office, maybe you're at a local hospital and you've looked at information from your electronic health records and you've noticed that there's this correlation, but you're not sure whether that's just a spurious correlation or whether that is something that's being reported in the literature. So it would be good to be able to easily assess if the correlation that you see is actually being reported in other studies. Well, maybe you're at a pharmaceutical company and your company has a treatment that you know works well for one particular disease, but what you want to know is how should you modify that treatment in order to make sure that it could treat a different disease. So all of these activities really need access to information in the published literature. So it's not sort of structured data, and there's a whole range of health informatics needs that do deal with structured information. But I wanted to sort of tell you a little bit about the unstructured text, in part because that's where my research fits. But I also think that there's been some advances in the kinds of technologies in this space that have really sort of opened up a whole range of activities that are very exciting and sort of contributing to sort of an acceleration of health informatics work. So the motivation here is really that there's an enormous increase in the number of papers, the number of information that's available electronically. So what I popped on this slide here is the number of breast cancer articles. So this is just one disease. And this is the number of abstracts that are published each year, right? So it's not the cumulative total of how many are in PubMed. This is the number that are added every year. And so even if you would only take 10 minutes to read an abstract, and if you work diligently every day for 8 hours a day, it would take you 25 years to read what's already in the literature. And by the way, then you would start reading all the stuff that's actually been added that you can see on this slide. So clearly, reading these things one by one is not going to work. There's just too much stuff. And while you could narrow your search criteria so that you only look at a small subset of these abstracts, that might change the question that you're interested in. And if there's been an advance, say there's something in lung cancer that might be relevant to your work in breast cancer, there's just no way that you're going to be able to keep up with lung cancer as well. So a lot of my work has been really emphasizing not give me every document about breast cancer, but rather once you've got the articles on breast cancer, why don't you synthesize that evidence from within those documents so that I can make better decisions, so that I can see what other treatments, what other diseases might my treatment be able to help with, or if there has been changes in diabetes activities, then that might be a time to update my clinical guidelines so that it reflects those changes in what the best scientific evidence that we have is captured in these abstracts, and yet it's really hard to sort of get that information out. And so what I've been working on is trying to build automated tools that extract information from the literature. And a piece of that work that I'm going to tell you about today is called the claim framework. And the sort of premise of this is that there is a language, a science language that people use when they share the results of their work. And it doesn't matter whether they're talking about genes and proteins or whether they're talking about patients who are getting treated for a new disease. They all say, here's what I found in my study in a controlled experiment. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what that framework might look like. So what are the elements of that language that people use to communicate their results? And then, of course, did I mention that there's 440,000 abstracts on breast cancer? So, coming up with the claim framework representations manually, that's not going to scale. So we need some sort of automated methods that can help us populate this claim framework. So the framework has 5 different kinds of claims. And the first one is an explicit claim that captures an agent and an object. So these are sort of the different facets that play a role in the claims, but let me give you some specific examples. So the explicit claim is when you have an agent, you have an entity in a sentence, and that entity is changing another entity. So in this example, we've got tamoxifen interfered with the activity of estrogen. So tamoxifen is a drug that treats breast cancer, and estrogen is something that is associated with breast cancer. And so you can see that this drug has interfered with estrogen. And I'm going to ask you guys now, can you see another claim? So tamoxifen interfered with the activity of estrogen. Did anything else interfere with the activity of estrogen? I'm going to see if I can find my chat window. There we go. You can just pop it in the chat window if you can. What's the other agent that's interfering with the activity of estrogen here? All right, looks like we've got a shy crowd. That's okay. So the other agent here, a separate claim, would be not the generic term for tamoxifen, but the actual drug name. And so this would be considered as 2 different claims from the same sentence. And as it turns out, explicit claims are the most frequent kind of claim that's reported in the literature. About 77% of all the claims are explicit. Explicit claims have a cousin called an implicit claim, which they don't appear very often, so I'm going to sort of cruise right on by those. Observations are the weakest kind of claim, where you know that something's changed, but you don't know what caused the change. And I should say that the claim framework is sort of a sentence by sentence analysis tool. And so it may be that the previous sentence told you what the agent was, but it's not in the current sentence that you're analyzing. Correlations or associations simply tell you that there's a relationship. It might be a positive, it might be a negative, but it's some kind of relationship between 2 entities. And comparisons, which we're going to sort of linger on a little bit today, I think are a really exciting kind of claim. So comparisons tell us at least 2 entities that were compared, and most importantly, they tell us how they were compared. So here we've got AML, which is a kind of leukemia, and so they're comparing these folks with leukemia and these normal controls, and what they're finding is that the plasma concentration of NM23H1 was higher. So I know, well, I don't know, but I don't have training in breast cancer in medical literature. But even without knowing what NM21H1 is, I know that it was higher. So I can pick out from that sentence, what was it that people measured when they were comparing the control group with the folks who had leukemia. So these comparison sentences are, I think, very exciting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our work in trying to automate that kind of claim. But before we get there, I just sort of want to give you a bit of an overview of, well, how many claims were there in a collection? And there was over 3,000. As I said, most of the claims are explicit, so about 77% of all the claims. And this, I should say that this study was actually done on full text articles, not just the abstract, the entire document. But if you just looked at the claims that were made, what we found was that there's only about 8% of the claims that are actually in the abstract. Now, they might be the most important claims, they might be the most relevant claims, but we, and again, the abstract's only 200 words, so of course there are going to be fewer claims. But it's interesting, I think, that much of the work in health informatics is actually done just on abstracts, and yet the full text is where most of this reporting is actually taking place. You can see here that there's a lot in the discussion section, a little bit in the introduction, and a little bit in the results. So that kind of gives you a lay of the land, sort of the bigger picture of the claim framework. But I wanted to zoom in on these comparison claims, because as I said, I think they are just really important. Now, they only appear about 5% of the time, but they are packed with information. And so we've been working on how to extract the elements from those comparison claims. And how we do that is we build a classifier. And so we take a sentence and we decide whether that sentence is a comparison or not. So the first experiment that I'm telling you about here, what we're trying to predict is this sentence a comparison or not? And we come up with a set of features. I'll tell you about those in a moment. But for now, you can just sort of think of each sentence as being a row in our matrix, and as each column is a feature, and we have a label. And so we feed this to our machine learning algorithm, which builds a model. And then we apply that model to a set of test data where we don't give the model what the answer is. And so by doing that, we have what the model says the answer is, and then we can compare that with what the actual answer is in order to evaluate whether this model is actually working very well or not. And then we repeat that with multiple different training and data sets in order to sort of get an idea of what the sensitivity is of our model. So I wanted to sort of come back a little bit to the features that we used in this first experiment. There's a resource that's provided by the National Library of Medicine, which is totally awesome, and it's a dictionary of medical terms. And what that gives us is the lemmatized version of terms, as well as lots of adjectives. So like think Superman, bigger, faster, stronger. They are key terms in our dictionary that will tell us whether a sentence contains a comparison or not. And then we have a set of direction verbs that come from a different study, and a couple of other lexical terms like twice the size of, or something versus something else might be a comparison. And we took all these semantic features and then added some syntactic features. Excuse me. So this gives us some context around the sentence. So maybe it was better than or slower than. Oh, excuse me for a moment. Excuse me. Yeah, so we have a combination of syntax and semantics. All right, I'm sorry, excuse me. So once we have our features, we then selected 3 different models: support vector machines and naive Bayes work really well for tech. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on here. So these models really work well and they've been shown to work well over time. Naive Bayes is called naive because it assumes that all of the words are independent. But obviously the words aren't independent because we have lower than, so those words usually go together. And so we also built a Bayesian network that captures that relationship between the words as a way of trying to improve the predictive accuracy of our model. So now we get to the fun part. How do we actually evaluate this? So I don't know if any of you have done a machine learning experiment, but the evaluation has sort of two really important components. So imagine that you like M&M, but you only like the red ones, right? So you have this great big jar, and what you're trying to do is two things. The first thing that you want is you want your model to only give you red ones. So the model should only give you the red ones. What we call that is precision. So of the M&Ms that the model gives you, you want the red ones. So it's the percentage of red ones from the M&Ms that the model gives you. The other thing is you don't want to miss any. You want all of the red M&Ms. So that's the other part of the puzzle, and we call that recall. So all the red M&Ms in the bottle, we want to make sure we get every single one of them. As it turns out, those metrics compete with each other. You can get perfect recall just by giving you everything in the jar, right? Because that will guarantee that you get all the red ones because you got all the M&Ms. But of course, that would mean that you got a lot of colors that aren't the colors you like. So these measures are things that we used in the experiment in order to evaluate the quality of the model. So in this first experiment, our akin to the red M&Ms is our sentences. We're trying to get comparison sentences. I'm going to jump over this and sort of focus on this one. So in the development set, the Bayesian network performed best on an F1 score. So F1 balances out precision and recall. And then on the validation set, the Bayesian network had the highest F1 score, so the combination of precision and recall. So you'll notice that the support vector machine had the best recall performance. So that made sure that you got all the red M&Ms. In this case, that made sure that we got all of the comparison sentences or a good chunk of them. And then the precision for the naive Bayes model was actually the highest. But as it turns out, you might remember that there's only 5% of the sentences that are comparisons. So if I said this sentence is not a comparison, you would have 95% accuracy, right? Because there's only 5% that are sentences. So what's more important for us is an evaluation of comparatives only. And so these are not just how well you did overall, but how well did you do on the actual comparison sentences that are of interest to us. And so you can see that here, and we'll just focus on the validation set, you can see that the precision was the highest using the support vector machine, and that gave us a 0.886. So of the sentences that the system gave us, 88% of them were comparisons and the others were not, so they were wrong. So we then said, okay, well, that's great, we've got the sentences, but we don't just want the sentences, we actually want to know what's the entities and what's the endpoints that are being reported. So we're not just interested in knowing that this is a sentence that contains a comparison. We want to know AML was one of the entities, the agent, normal controls was the second entity, the object, and then the way that they were measured was this NM23H1. So we've really shifted now. We're not looking at sentences. Now we're looking at individual noun phrases, and we're trying to predict, is this noun phrase an entity that's being compared, or is it the actual thing that you're measuring. So we really shift gears. And again, why we want to do that is we want to pull this information out of the sentences and create a table so that you can see everything that's being compared, so that you might see, wow, look, it looks like maybe the diabetes literature has evolved, so I should update my clinical guidelines. So this kind of tool is something that can pull these things out and trigger when a clinical guideline or new information should be investigated. So we had a two-step process in experiment 2. And again, experiment 2, now we're at the noun phrase level. The first one was to get the comparison sentences. So the first one is actually the first experiment. The first step in this second experiment is actually the result from the first experiment. And then the second step is where we start to build another classifier. And this time our classifier is going to predict a noun phrase rather than the entire sentence. So what we did was we actually wrote a series of rules. So we went back to experiment 1 and we said, what are the words in here? And can we just use those words? And we did that for 3 different journals, diabetes, carcinogenesis, and endocrinology. And what's interesting is, remember how in the first study there was about 5% of sentences that were claims? It would seem that 5% is sort of mirrored across different collections. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing that we noticed was long sentences that have many different sort of elements to them were not only difficult for a computer system to process, but it was also difficult for a human being to process. And so in this experiment, we just focused on shorter sentences, which reduced the number of sentences that we had. And so the question you're probably asking yourself at this point is, well, did the rules that we applied here work as well as the machine learning that we did in experiment 1? So the rules that we applied here is really hard to get a handle on recall, because recall would mean that you'd have to read all the sentences, and obviously with 2 million sentences, that's not feasible. So what we did was we randomly sampled 1,000 sentences and manually checked them to see if they were comparisons. And so our precision was 86.6%. And if we go back to the earlier study, the best precision in the validation set with machine learning was 0.886. So we lost a couple of percent, but we also didn't need to train a model to actually get this. So we lived with that error and moved on to trying to figure out how to get noun phrase labels. What we did exactly the same as we did before, but now instead of having each row be a sentence, now we've got each row is a noun phrase, and our features are distances to anchor terms. So the anchor terms that we use to get the sentences, we measured how far away is our noun phrase from those different anchors. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. So here we have a 2-fold increase in ALT activity was observed in serum from diabetic rats. I'm sorry, that should be rats, not rates, compared with lean controls. So the rats and the controls are the entities that are being compared. And then the ALT activity is what you're measuring. And what you'll see here is this is the paths, the sentence paths. So we've got a verb at the top, and observed is one of our anchors. Increase is one of our anchors, and compared is one of our anchors. And so we would measure sort of ALT activity and the distance to increase, the distance to observe, the distance to compared. Diabetic rats, same thing, what's the distance? And then lean controls, what's the distance? So each of these measures become one of our features that we then build a model on. So in terms of how well the model worked, again, noun phrases now, for the second entity, for the object, one of the entities that are being compared, the model did quite well, and it didn't really matter much whether you're using a general linear model or a support vector machine model. Both of them did quite well. However, the agent and the endpoint, so the first entity that was being compared and how you measured that comparison was very difficult for the model to discern. There was lots of confusion between those two roles in a sentence. And so, that wasn't good. So what we did, so this is the original precision and recall. And I'm sort of going to, well, actually, no, we've got a little bit of time here. So I did just want to mention that you can see the development set here has much better performance for the last object. So this is the second entity that we're measuring here. But you can see there isn't that much difference. But when I show you the endpoints and the agent, you see how things really start to drop. So here we've got sort of the little triangle is short and long sentences. The little square is short sentences. So let's have a look at the endpoints for support vector machines. You see that the short sentences, the performance for those is sort of above and a little bit further out than the circles, which are the long sentences. So that tells you that the precision is better and the recall is also a little better. So again, this just sort of reinforces that these models work better for shorter sentences than longer sentences. But again, overall, the model doesn't do so well with endpoints and with agents, with the first entity. So we went back to the drawing board again, did a third experiment, and this time we added some semantics to the actual noun phrase. And we said, is this an amount? Is it a measure, a number of, a percentage of, a frequency of? Is it an actual amount or is it a population group? So is it patients? Because that might indicate that it's an entity rather than a measure. And we also modified the task. What we had been doing was setting things up as a binary classifier. So we set it up as a multi-class classifier as well. And what we want to see is if this does better, then the square, the without the group, the amount in the group, so without the thing that we just added, the square should be less, and the circle, the adding the amount in the group, adding these semantics should be more. And what more looks like in this chart is it should be increased precision, so it should be further up on the chart, and it should also have better recall, so it should be further to the right. So you can see that in the support vector machine with the linear model, really didn't make any difference to the second entity. It was doing well before, it was still doing well after. Made a little bit of difference with a Gaussian model, so that you can see the square has sort of gone up and across a little bit, but again, not too much. And the performance for that second entity is already pretty good. It didn't make much of a difference. But the performance for the first entity, I think made a much bigger difference, right? So for the blue dot, you see that it really sort of stretched it over. The red dot didn't make too much of a difference. So for a two-class problem, it didn't help too much for the linear model. With the Gaussian model, again, you see that shift across to the right and up, which means that the model is doing better with this semantic information than without that semantic information. And the same thing happened for the endpoint prediction. So again, up and over, we get a little bit of up, not so much, improvement in terms of recall performance. And then with the Gaussian model, we didn't get as much difference for the endpoint prediction. So, that's sort of just an overview of kind of automated methods that can pull out comparisons. And there's other kinds of claims, and I'd love to talk to you some more about those because I think they're really interesting. But I would kind of be remiss if you left this presentation thinking that literature was the only thing that you could do in health informatics. So I'll tell you a little bit more about those in a moment, but just to kind of wrap up this comparison work, what I'm showing you now is basically the result of using the models that I just introduced earlier. So what the models did showed us what's being compared and how you were comparing things. And so we just looked at the most frequent entity, and we looked at the diabetes literature, and metformin was the most reported entity in either the first or the second role. And so then we pulled out, well, what are the things that metformin is being compared to? And it was a whole series of different drugs. And I should say, we never encoded any of these drugs in advance. So there's no need for this to have entity recognition in place. This works without it, which is a little bit different to some of the other models that folks use. It also pulled back things like placebo groups. So the metformin group was often compared with a placebo or a control group, which makes total sense. And it was also compared with exercise, so things that weren't drugs, but other interventions that folks use with diabetes. So across the top of this chart, you see all of the different things that metformin was compared to. And then on the left-hand side, you see the way in which that comparison was made. So you see variations of insulin. And of course, if you're an expert, you could tell me whether these variations were important or not. That the system is telling you what was it that people used in order to make that comparison. So it's giving you information about how to measure these things. This is a different endpoint. So this is glucose. And again, we've got combinations now of multiple drugs. In the middle here, these cells were done manually. So what this means is, let's see, so T refers to troglycerone, which is the drug that metformin was being compared to. And you can see that it has a greater efficiency than M. And that little number down the bottom is what the PubMed identifier is. So if you wanted to go back to the paper and actually see what was that sentence, where was it reported, you could do that. So this work was done in collaboration with some fantastic students. Anna Lusick, this was her dissertation for the comparison work, and she did a fantastic job. And she is now working as a data analyst, continuing to do some health work, but also sort of venturing out into a variety of different models. Henry Gabb also worked on some of these activities, the claim predictions, and he's working at Intel as a data analyst. So, you know, folks sort of went on to do bigger, better things. So I miss them, but I'm thrilled that they're doing well. So they were doctoral students. Master students also went on to either do further research or went into industry. A lot of them went into industry. I did just want to say a couple of things about other activities that you can do in a health informatics career, because, you know, mining text is certainly not the only one. As you can imagine, there are huge quantities of data that is being collected about health. And certainly when you think of data about health, your mind might go straight to electronic health records. There's been massive advances in electronic health records and sort of sharing data between institutions whilst maintaining privacy has really come a long way over the last few years, which is very exciting. But there's also other kinds of data that hasn't yet been integrated into that kind of resource. So for example, how many folks have a Fitbit or a smartwatch that measures the number of steps that they take? Does anybody have a smartwatch? I actually just got one and I'm charging it because I'm not used to wearing it yet. But does anybody else have a device that measures how many steps you walk, how much exercise you have? No? Awesome. Yeah, phones do this as well. So if you have a cell phone, that's probably measuring how many steps you take as well. So this information really starts to become important as you think more broadly around not just health as kind of something you pay attention to when you get sick, but more like how do we maintain our health? How do we manage chronic conditions rather than just thinking about acute decisions? And how do we put practices in place that keep people healthy so they don't go to the hospital? These are sort of massive undertakings that are very exciting, but also they need informatics. They need information science in order to curate that information, to figure out how to share it without giving away where you were walking, because obviously that has security implications, that there's a whole wealth of work to be done, and it's an exciting time to be in that space. The other thing that health informatics sort of really leads a lot of fields in is knowledge representation. So while I might think of, say, a heart attack, a physician might see that as cardiac arrest. So like the words there aren't the same. One sort of phrase is a layperson's representation, and the other is a physician's representation. And there's probably a whole suite of other expressions from different cultures that capture different medical conditions or symptoms or things that we should pay attention to on the health front. And so trying to figure out kind of ontologies, how we represent that knowledge, is a very challenging problem. And honestly, health informatics has really led the way in ontology development, and is actually a reason why a lot of people do computational work in this space, is because those knowledge resources are available. And I'm certainly myself very grateful to the NLM for making some of those resources available. So I know that's kind of a lot to take in. I sort of wanted to give you, I don't know, a little lesson in text mining as we go through the kinds of positions that are available in health informatics. And so I very much welcome your questions. And I wasn't honestly real sure what kinds of things you guys might be interested in learning about. So if I didn't touch on something that you really want to know about, or if you have a question about, I will do my best to answer you. Yeah, if you have any questions, just you're welcome to turn on your video. You're welcome to chat in the chat window. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you for your attention and open it up for questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Blake. It was really, really very exciting to learn about, and there was a lot going on that was very technical, so I was excited that you were explaining it to me as a non-technical person. So maybe while people are preparing questions, or if they're feeling a little shy, could you talk a little bit more about maybe how students could start getting into health informatics, or some of the core classes that might be beneficial for them if they're considering pursuing a health informatics degree?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there's multiple paths to access some of this information. And I'm kind of heavily involved in the information management program. I'm the program director there. So sort of I'll probably lean towards that program, not because I think it has specifically more health informatics, just because I kind of know those courses inside and out. But that program is sort of really oriented around sort of information management, which is how do you kind of have best practice around data storage. These hospitals are really struggling with how to keep their electronic records and how to evolve them over time. So let me give you an example of why this is really challenging. One of the things that has evolved over time is our understanding of gender. And you know, when folks are asked gender, you know, it used to be just one box or another box. And now, you know, we understand that that's a much more fluid representation. And so what does that mean if you're doing analytics on health data? I mean, it's not really that those other categories didn't exist before. It's just that we didn't really measure them before. And so I've done some really interesting projects with the US Department of Veterans Affairs. And they have a wonderful repository of health data that goes back decades. But as we're trying to analyze that data, thinking about these contexts and how our understanding of how people identify and how that manifests in a health record, that has really changed, which becomes, a struggle when it comes to analyzing the data and how to account for that. So in the IM program, information management tools that help you track some of those changes and organize those changes become super important. We have another course on socio-technical information systems. And the sort of prompt for that course is, I can build a fantastic information system and I can put it in one hospital, and I can take that exact same system and try and put it in another hospital. And even though it worked great in the first one, it's going to fail dismally in the second. And actually one of the stereotypical examples was actually a system that was put into a hospital. And in one setting, it really accelerated the productivity of the doctors, and it made people healthier, right? It resulted in fewer deaths, in fewer sort of drugs that interacted with each other. So it was a really productive and beneficial, not just for physicians, but for patients. In the other system, because the information system changed the dynamic between physicians and nurses, what happened was that the physicians sabotaged the system, because the nurses could actually have access to information that they didn't have access to before. And the physicians in that, the university hospital, they didn't like that at all, right? So you had the same system in two different places, and one place it works and one place it doesn't. So socio-technical information systems sort of gives us kind of a deeper appreciation of how to unpack some of those socio components that go into actually having a successful system. Understanding who the stakeholders are, understanding work practices and workflows. These are things that you really need, because that will change whether the same system will work or not. And then, of course, the other required course in the IM program is the Data Information and Statistics course. And so that, I've again talked a lot about unstructured information, but a lot of information in the medical world is structured. And what I mean by that is it's categorical. So when you go in to see the doctor, you get a code, and that's usually an ICD-9 code, an international classification of disease. I just call it ICD-9. I just, at some point you forget what it stands for. So yes, International Classification of Disease, I think is right. And so thank you, Mendy. Thank you very much for coming. Yeah, so, those codes can then be used to conduct analyses. Excellent question, Elaine. I think that we as individuals are going to continue to be more responsible for our own health, which is kind of scary, because health is a big area and many of us, like myself, are not trained in health. So I think the trend in health informatics is empowering people to make their own health decisions. Sometimes it's called personalized health informatics, personalized medicine. A lot of the implications to personalized medicine are actually at a genetic level. So basically, I want your genes, and then I'm going to get you a treatment that corresponds just to you. And we're not there yet. We don't have treatments that are precise enough to actually sort of, work at that level. But we're moving in that direction. And so, again, there's sort of a two directions here. One is you as an individual are going to be more responsible for your own health. The other is that the healthcare services are going to be more tailored towards individuals. And I guess the last trend that I can see is sort of this shift away from sort of a very narrow view. So really thinking more broadly about what it means to be healthy. The air that we breathe, the things that we come into contact with, how are those things interacting with our own health? Mental health, of course, is another sort of area that's on the increase. So I think there's a lot of demand. I think we all want to be healthy. We all want to be active. And so I think there's a real need for that. But I also think there's sort of advances in new informatics techniques that can allow us to actually do some of this and empower people to make decisions. So maybe I'm still going to eat that little piece of chocolate cake, but I'll exercise a little bit more to make up for it. Right. So I'll be making choices for myself, but I'll be given information that can help me make smarter choices. Thank you for a great question. Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for asking such wonderful questions. So there are a lot of entry-level positions available in this area. Understanding the electronic health record is sort of a big part of that puzzle. A lot of hospitals are, so I guess in the last 5 years, there's been a big shift in how the extent to which cloud computing can actually support some of these things that we'd like to do with health information. So obviously health information is, incredibly private and is, really, susceptible to real harm if people actually get information that they're not supposed to have access to. And HIPAA is a set of policies that make sure that health data is not shared. But as I say, advances in security in cloud computing have now gone to the point where we can be assured that some of those privacy concerns that had existed in the past have actually been dealt with. So, an entry-level position, if you know about cloud computing, that's something that could, sort of get you into this kind of work. Multiple advanced degrees are not required. A lot of people do have some molecular biology background, a little bit of understanding in health, but a lot of these challenges are classic information science challenges. Things like quality, curation, representation. These are classic knowledge, information science areas. And so an information science degree would prepare you well for this kind of area. We're in Urbana-Champaign. I'm not sure how many of you are local, but our hospital here is constantly trying to get folks into our local hospital, which again is just a little hospital, but a lot of demand. And then the smartwatch example, I think is, again, a really fantastic question, because it's clear that that kind of information could be used to help us improve our health. But the privacy issues, I don't think have been addressed yet. I'm actually working on a different project. Masuda Bashir, who is another faculty member here in the iSchool, her whole research is about privacy. And so we're working on a project with her in order to unpack different privacy guidelines and frameworks, and sort of trying to build text mining tools that help us understand some of these privacy agreements. And so I'm very interested actually in seeing sort of how companies sort of what data do people collect? How do they use that data? How do they share it with other people? And not sort of so that you have to read 14 pages of, you know, a privacy policy document, but building systems that actually pull out that information and show it to you so that you can make an informed decision. And this will, the idea of wearable technologies is really such an important area. So let me, again, if I can give you another example. One of the things that is really important for folks with asthma is the kind of air that they breathe, right? You know, their lung pathways can be sort of really sensitive. And so, you know, if they're in an area where there's a fire or, you know, where there's some sort of pollution that comes through, you know, it can be really harmful and they can have an asthma attack. It's really interesting, and I guess I didn't know until I had talked to these folks, is particularly for kids, because kids are short, exhaust pipes are sort of at kid level. And so what you end up with is that the level of toxins at different elevations, and I mean, I'm talking like at 3 feet or 5 feet or 8 feet, are very, very different. And so when somebody tells you, oh, the air quality is X, Y, Z, the next thing you should ask is, well, where did you take that measurement? And so there was an exciting competition, I think it was by the EPA put this on, and it was a wearable device. It was sort of, it's not, I don't think it's out there yet. So it's sort of one of these future things down the line, but it sort of sat around the person's neck and it was measuring air quality sort of here, like right at where you're breathing. And again, it was a prototype, right? It wasn't it wasn't built into a Fitbit yet. But it was fascinating because they demonstrated this. There was a guy riding a bicycle and his monitor went off the charts as sort of having a lot of particle matters in the air. And he didn't realize, but I guess there was somebody burning off leaves, and there must have been a breeze that sort of brought the smoke sort of right where he was sort of riding his bike. And it was fascinating to see sort of that wearable technology is not just sort of generating data that we can use, but it's getting that level of precision so that you as an individual can have a much better sense of your own practices and your own behaviors, which is going to really sort of revolutionize how we understand how those factors influence your health. Because right now they're sort of not precise enough for us to actually make some conclusions about that. So I think it's going to be very exciting to see how they're folded into that picture. Because there's interesting questions about ownership there too. Who owns that data and how can I get access to it? Thanks, Michelle, for great questions. So I'm curious, did you have sort of careers that you were thinking of in health informatics, or you're just sort of curious, or were there particular areas that you were thinking that you might go into? As you're thinking, I guess I should also add that this last year, or maybe it was the year before, we actually hired somebody who used to work for the National Library of Medicine, Halil Kaloji, and he is awesome. He has very broad interests, but he is sort of deeply steeped in health informatics. So I think, Emma, you mentioned how might people get involved in this sort of work. Certainly taking courses is a way to get involved, but sort of paying attention to what folks are doing in their research is also, you know, another way to kind of get engaged with these kinds of activities. And you know, we often have lecture series, so you can listen to what other people are up to. Actually, we have a fascinating lecture series this semester on privacy, which is not just health, but also, a range of different areas. So it's super fun to be sort of in an environment where there's lots of things to go to.
Khalil actually gave a presentation on Tuesday for INFOcon, and that was the first time I'd ever interacted with him or heard him speak about his work. And he talked a lot about text analysis, and he did talk a lot about his work with COVID-19, and it was just really interesting. And like I said, it's the first time I've interacted with him, but he's absolutely brilliant and his presentation was amazing. So I'm grateful that we were recording all these sessions so that everybody can have the opportunity to go back and rewatch them, as I'm sure many people will do. But I also want to go back and rewatch and actually be able to completely focus on the content that all of our faculty members have talked about.
Yeah, no, he's doing some great stuff. He's got some work on factuality, which is just, just brilliant. It's really great. Yeah, we're definitely lucky to have him join us. Are there questions or comments? Yes. So thank you for a great question, Michelle, about special librarianship for local cancer centres. Folks are really, really struggling with how to organise their data. And so I really think that, the things that you learn in the LIS program where, you understand how to organise information, where you can do sort of reference interviews to see what people want, those skills are so needed for data. So yes, I think you should definitely look into that. And some folks like some, again, this goes not just for librarianship, but also for sort of information science writ large, is, a little bit of reading in the area. But again, I think the skills from the LIS program really transfer wonderfully to the data curation activities that are really needed. Yeah, I think so. An interest in biology is also really important here. So, I mentioned the drug repurposing as a potential case study. Well, one of the things that you want to do if you're going to repurpose a drug is not just look at the disease and the treatment, but you want to drop down to the kinds of molecular activities that are going on. So yeah, I mean, a background in biology would be awesome. I think you'd really thrive. We do actually have a bioinformatics program. It's a cross-campus activity. So we in the iSchool have one version of it, and then there's a group from computer science who has another version, and from plant science who has another version. And so there's sort of these campus-wide courses that you take, and then within your different unit, you take a set of courses that are specific to that particular unit. So that, again, if you have a background in biology, you would be probably well prepared to enter that program as well. It's a smallish program, but I think there's some really interesting work that's coming out of that. So I suspect we're getting close to the end of our time together, but I guess I just sort of wanted to give you an open invitation. If you do want to follow up, feel free to drop me an email. I'd be happy to chat with you more about what your interests are, or if I can help you get onto a program that aligns with your career goals.
Yes, I put your faculty profile in the chat box,
Perfect.
Professor Blake, so they can read a little bit more about your research and what you're teaching, and then also contact you if they're interested in communicating with you further. I also threw in the links to the bioinformatics program at the iSchool at the University of Illinois, as well as the INFOcon session links. So we have 2 sessions today, and then that's going to conclude our event. So we thank you so much for participating today. Thank you for coming to hear Professor Blake. And Professor, thank you so much for such an amazing talk. I think that you had some really great questions and you were really able to engage here, and that's what INFOcon is about. So we're very grateful for your participation, and thank you to everyone who came today. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries. This is why I have a Shih Tzu, because she doesn't bark, she just sleeps. Thank you all for joining. Bye.